includes this sentiment, only that we would live lives worthy of the gospel, only that we would live and not perish. There's this wonderful dichotomy that Christianity helps us to understand. Early followers of Jesus were called the followers of the way, not Christians, but the followers of the way. For Jesus says that I set before you the ways of life and death. And what Jesus tries to help us understand in his ministry, and what Paul emphasizes here in his letter to the Philippians, is that we are to be seeking how to live in areas of our lives, to do things that are feeding our spirit and life-giving, rather than things that are destructive or carve out of us a peace that makes us whole and worthy. We are to be people who live the way, to walk in the way, and to pray and worship in the way of a God that is more gracious and more holy and more loving than we can ever understand or acknowledge. And yet that is the way. And so this morning we think about the ways in which that we can live into Paul's wish for that community and for us here in this day and this age, that we might live a life worthy of the gospel. Which is odd because I titled my sermon this morning, Go Ahead and Complain, as an invitation to not whine, but to understand more in light what it means to live and walk in a way worthy of the gospel. Sometimes I feel like we as Christians feel like we don't have the space to complain. We're supposed to follow Jesus and take up our cross and bear our burdens and do the work of ministry and just be absolutely okay that it's fine and dandy and sunshine and rainbows and unicorns all the time. But the reality is that life is not sunshine and rainbows and unicorns all the time. And we come up into moments and eras and times for which life is harder than that. And so we must do some of the discernment work that it takes to lift us out of the ugliness that life can be, the ways of death, as Jesus has said it, so that we can live more fully into the ways of life. And one of those ways I would like to propose this morning is by complaining. And we see that modeled in a good way here in our Genesis text, in which we hear about the Israelites who have been in captivity under the Egyptians for generations. And Moses, as the story goes, sees God in a burning bush, goes to Pharaoh and demands the release of the Israelites, and then leads the Israelites out of their captivity in Egypt into not the promised land, as they had been told, but into the wilderness for 40 years. And so they find themselves in this wilderness, the whole of the Israelites, and Moses as their leader guiding them through this desert, and they set up camps here and there as they wander. And over time, the Israelites begin to realize that they may have gotten the short end of the stick. How many of you have been out camping in the desert before? Yeah, or at least been out on a hike. We have plenty of desert around here for us. Now imagine being out there for 40 years, and you might begin to understand a little bit of where the Israelites are coming from. There's not the meals, the food that they enjoyed when they were living perhaps a little bit more lavishly than our typical idea of what slave means. They had homes, they had food and access to education for certain members of their culture and class. They had jobs, they had work. And they actually had it pretty good compared to what they were promised they were going to have and then ended up with in the desert. Well, the Israelites are talking about this in their small little circles, in their tents, around the campfire. Do you remember what it was like to not have to eat whatever it is that we're having out here in the desert? the full meals, the wonderful water, the cooking that we were able to do when we were living with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And they're like, oh yeah, that was pretty good. That was pretty good. Well, the Israelites were stuck in this framework of trying to maintain or sustain what it was that they had. In fact, they were invested in trying to maintain and sustain what they had, to the point where they were willing to say that it was far better for them to go back into slavery and live under the Egyptians, under oppression, than it was for them to have the freedoms and liberties of living with Moses and God in the wilderness. They were willing to give up the joy of being with God to stay under the oppression of a system of evil. How many times in our lives are we willing to make that sacrifice as well? To try and maintain what it is we have, even though it's not the best for us. It doesn't feed our spirits. It doesn't move us into something more beautiful. Well, the Israelites began to complain. And they complained to each other, and they complained to Moses, and they complained to God. Complaining is an important part of lifting up what is happening in our lives. It's about being authentic. It's about being honest. It's about challenging the norm and saying that there could be something different here. In our culture and society, we lift up here in America, one of our greatest values is the freedom of self-expression. The freedom to say what it is that we want and need in this world, to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those freedoms are of the utmost importance in the ways that we guide our culture and society. So it's important that we too feel empowered to lift up places where we are struggling and say, I want to complain about what this is. A little bit about the word complain. The word comes from our medieval Latin, and it can be translated as lament, or groan, or creak under strain. And so to complain means to groan with the weight of the injustices that we might experience. That life isn't fair. And so to complain means to give voice and to let that be transparent. We as a people who believe in the freedoms of all people need to understand that complaining is a part of what creates a healthy society. In fact, it's what creates a healthy church. You see, rather than trying to sustain or maintain something that doesn't work and we struggle with, it's important that we complain about it, that we lift up, that we work together to find solutions. And not complain as in the way that one might whine over and over about something superficial, but to complain about something that is core to what is important. Again, the way of life over the way of death. And through that process of complaining, we let go of the way that we maintain or try to sustain things, and we see transformation happen. You see, God's great transformation happens in relation to us. We see this in the Israelites in the desert. Because God says, Moses, go and tell the people that I have heard the Israelites' complaints. And this is what I will do about it. And so out of the Israelites complaining, God provides for the Israelites quail for meat to eat. And in the morning, manna that falls like dew upon the land. Bread to sustain the people, God's people. Now, I don't think this is what the Israelites wanted when they started complaining to God and lamenting to God. They were hoping for something better, the promised land that they knew was before them. But God knew something better, more deeper, about what the Israelites really needed. God did hear their complaining, and God provided something that was essential for their journey. God demonstrated that we can be in relationship with each other, and that if we're not getting what we need, we can ask for something, and something will be provided. But we should be in awe of the things that God provides for us, the miracles that come our way that are most unexpected. Where in your life are you feeling like you're just treading water? You're trying to sustain or maintain whatever it might be. And deep in your core, you know you need to say something out loud, or you might sink, or drown, or remain captive to whatever experience that is. Our Christian word for today is to say something, to give it voice, to give it wings that it might sing and give others around you hope. That we might walk away from the way of death into the way of life. By hearing one another, it's not just about complaining, it's also about hearing. Where in your life are you expecting something from God? Expecting to see a certain type of miracle? And how can you shift that to see the dew that falls before you each morning as a miracle? The wildlife that comes to you in the evening as a miracle? Where is God giving you life this day for the times that you live in here and now? Reverend Dr. Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite writes in one of her theological books that she edited that Gustavo Gutierrez is considered one of the fathers of liberation theology. Liberation theology is something that I believe in. It's a theology that says that in this world there's oppression and there's liberation. And God is always on the side of those who are oppressed and seeks for us to be liberated from that oppression. And we see that clearly in the story of the Israelites, who God sent Moses to free from their oppression and bring them into liberation. It wasn't the liberation that they had wanted or thought it would look like, but it led them into something more fruitful, more abundant, more joyful than they could have ever imagined. Susan Thistlethwaite says that Gustavo Gutierrez writes a lot about liberation theology, and he once gave a short introduction to liberation theology to a very senior professor of theology. Gutierrez was being honored at a faculty reception at this school where he was a visiting professor, and there was a lavish buffet. And a senior professor of theology, carrying a plate piled high with food from the buffet, came over to where Gutierrez and Dr. Thistlethwaite was sitting and chatting. And the professor loomed over Gutierrez and said, "So," the senior professor intoned, "Professor Gutierrez, explain liberation theology to me." Gutierrez looked at this senior professor and said, "It's a matter of the stomach." The stomach? The large and portly senior professor said, astonished. "Yes," said Gutierrez, looking at the professor's loaded plate. "You do theology differently when your stomach is full than when it is empty." You see, it's easy for us to think about how pointless it is for the Israelites to complain in their situation, but their stomachs were empty, and they needed their stomachs to be filled with something. And so God comes to us in our times of need, not with a plate that is piled over high for just the few and the lucky, not just for the leadership, not just for Moses. But God opens the whole buffet table to all of us. That's the theology of the table which we come to next Sunday and celebrate World Communion. For it's not a table that is exclusive to just us here in the United Church of Christ, or just this community, and just not Protestants, but to all people throughout all the world, all who sit with stomachs that are hungry, that yearn for more from God and from us. There's another story I'd like to tell about a young man who was not happy about what was happening in his church. And in fact, he was a college professor. And he had some time to think deeply about some of the stuff that his church was doing. One of the things that his church had done over and over again was talk so much about money, the need for money, that it overwhelmed the other things that he felt were very important. He saw that his pastor was one who demanded things and told people how to do their life and work. And he saw that the way that the minister, the senior pastor, had controlled the church was being destructive and leading the church more to the pathways of death than it was leading to the pathways of life. So this young man, this college professor, began writing down his ideas because he knew that he needed to say something. Because if he didn't, then his church that he loved would come to ruin. One day, this, what I would like to think, brave college professor did, is he walked up to the front office door of this pastor, and he took his notes that he had been jotting down, and he nailed them onto the door, so that he would be sure that the senior minister would see that. Now, word got out about what he had done, and it kind of spread like wildfire. And over 500 years later, we were celebrating what this young college professor did, Martin Luther. You see, Martin Luther saw something that was happening in his church that he didn't like, and he knew he needed to say something. And so he crafted 95 theses and went to the church door and nailed it to the door. Maybe not literally, but it's a story we've come to know and appreciate. And this year we celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. To complain, to raise up and lift up the voice of the voiceless, to say that we need more life and less death in our lives, is to be Christian, is to be a part of the church. And we celebrate that tradition in our church, here and now, on this day. Where further are the places in our lives that we are called to rise up, to give voice, and to liberate those who are feeling oppressed in today's culture and society, and indeed even here in the church. For God has yet more light and truth to break forth from God's holy word. Only may you live your life worthy of the gospel. Amen.